Welcome back to another podcast episode as we're rebranding it to the Built in Ohio podcast, because what's fun is we're talking with people that have been building companies and building ideas in our state and helping grow the tech sector in the state of Ohio. And we have one today, Ryan Frederick, who is a principal at AWH, which is a technology consulting firm that helps companies grow by leveraging technology. Ryan's also an author of 2 books and speaks frequently about digital products and leadership. And I'll have to say, Ryan, that as I got to kind of get my speed up and running over the past few years about tech in our state, tech in Columbus, I was going to things at like Rev One and some other places where I got to see you speak. And when I kind of think of like the tech community in Columbus, you're one of the first people I think of from all the work, the speaking engagements you've been doing. So I'm excited to have you on the show. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Chris. That's very sweet of you to say. I appreciate that. It probably just means I'm old at this point, and I've hung around long enough to have the good fortune to get the chance to grab a mic in various circumstances. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's cool. It's been fun, and like I said, some of those Rev One events where you'd host conversations were always cool, and a fun way to kind of get to discover and kind of get into the tech sector here in town. But to start, if you could maybe just share a little bit about yourself. We read off that you're a principal at AWH, but getting to know you, and we'll kind of dig in a little bit to what AWH is up to. But your background, where are you from originally, and kind of what's your story of getting into tech?
Yeah, small town country boy, grew up in upstate New York. Knew that I needed to leave there if I was going to sort of fulfill my potential, whatever that meant at the time. I was not a great student in high school. I was always one of those that the teachers wrote on the report cards, right? Unmotivated, underperforming, disinterested, etc. I was just sort of bored, and couldn't make sense of a lot of it. So I didn't get a lot of offers for college, and it came down to a recruiter from DeVry came to my high school at the time, and and that seemed to make sense to go get a computer science degree. And my 2 options were Princeton, New Jersey, or Columbus. And Columbus seemed to be more of a culture fit than going to Princeton, New Jersey, even though I didn't know anything about Princeton, New Jersey, had never been there. So I was, as most of us probably do at that age, I was making some very uninformed decisions, and ended up in Columbus to go to DeVry, and then got really, really fortunate and ended up at worked at CompuServe for a little while, and then ended up at a startup that I didn't really know was a startup, because this was late 80s, early 90s, and we just were a small business trying to make it. And it was this weird compilation of the Ohio State Bar Association and some angel investors from Wichita, Kansas, of all places, that were funding this startup. And we had some success with it. We grew the company. It was able to sell. There was an exit. And then I saw an opportunity to solve another problem that was sort of tangential to that problem what that company was doing. And I convinced the investors to fund that company, and then ultimately have been a part of starting 6 software companies, and then 12 years ago joined AWH as a partner, and so the last 12 years have been grinding away at AWH, helping clients mostly build digital products, and to solve data challenges and to go through some digital transformation. So that's Ryan in a nutshell.
Well, first off, I love like when there's these, well, it was Princeton or Columbus, and I kind of just settled on Columbus, and it doesn't have to be about location, but just in life where there's those like moments that obviously are like very huge, but we're just kind of like, well, yeah, I'll kind of go with this one
Right.
versus that one, and here we are.
flip a coin, and then
Yeah.
and then 27 years later, right, your life
Yep.
has taken a very distinct path that it
Yeah.
wouldn't have if you had gone in a different direction.
Yeah.
So for better or for worse, I think we all have lots of coin flips in
Yeah.
our history that sort of dictate the path of life. And that's also one of the things that I talk to a lot of founders about when I get the chance to is I'd rather be opportunistic rather than strategic at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to be strategic on top of something that isn't really an opportunity, then you're putting a lot of time and energy into something that is probably not going to bear that much fruit.
Yeah.
Where if you have an opportunity that now you can sort of, apply some heat to and pop, right? Then you can get strategic. But strategy on top of something that isn't very opportunistic and is kind of pointless ultimately.
Yeah. Well, I guess to start, I'd love to kind of get your take on the Columbus tech story, and I'm guessing you've been through what you said, 6 different companies and now at AWH and all the kind of community building, and I know you host your innovator roundtable. So you are, part of, as I said at the beginning, and I truly mean it, like one of the people that I think of when I think of tech in Columbus. What has it been like over, the years that you've been in it? Because, I haven't been in it all that long compared to a lot of other people. And, even in the past kind of 2 years with COVID, it seems like there's been these dramatic shifts. And then you back it up in either 2 or 4 years from there. And there's kind of been these, momentous things you think of, Cover My Meds and Root and kind of Drive Capital. But the story kind of backs up before then too. So I mean, if you could, I'd love to kind of get your take on it, because I always find it interesting asking people. Everyone has a different perspective, of course, but you've been in it, so like I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, it's changed a lot, and mostly for the better. When in a couple of the companies that I've been a part of starting were not headquartered in Columbus. One was in New York and one was in Detroit. So there were also periods of time where I wasn't really, even though I was living in Columbus, I wasn't really doing business in Columbus. But when I started when I joined AWH as a partner, and then I started doing things like Startup Grind, which is some of the events that you've been to at Rev One. Frankly, we were having to sort of go drag people in because Columbus did not have much of a startup scene. People didn't really want to sort of admit they were a founder and they were trying to start a company. And there wasn't that much going on, frankly, in the startup community. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to join Startup Grind and to do it in Columbus. Is I felt like there needed to be more platforms and there needed to be more outlets to talk about what people were working on and the challenges that they were having, and to connect people together, right? And to be able to begin to build, and this is an overused term, but to begin to build a little bit of an ecosystem, which is really just a fabric of a startup community that you realize, oh, I'm not on an island. I'm not the only one trying to build a company in this location. And then, the only thing that I will say is you don't have anything as a startup ecosystem until you have some success, because until you actually produce some sustainable companies that have validated that it can happen, it remains just sort of amorphous and it remains talk.
Yeah.
So full credit to the Matt Scantlins of the world, right, from Cover My Meds, and Dan Mangus from Root, and those kinds of cats. And Tanisha Robinson before them, right? And so we also can't forget the people that were starting companies before Cover My Meds and Root, because you need success to validate that it can happen where you are. Because until you have those proof points, and until you have the reality of people then looking at it and saying, okay, it's possible in a place like Columbus, that all remains very theoretical.
Yeah.
And I think that if anything, the threshold we've crossed in Columbus, and probably beyond Columbus, more broadly in Ohio, and maybe even more broadly in the Midwest, is now we have lots of examples that we can point to say, not only is it possible, but been there, done that. And now people don't question it as much as they would have, certainly 10 or 12 years ago, when people were like, geez, is it really possible to start a company right here that's going to grow to IPO or to have a major exit? And so The founders and the people that have done it deserve most of the credit, because without that, nothing else really matters. The rest of it's kind of just talk.
Yeah. And one other question on this before we talk about some of your stuff with kind of tech and emerging new technologies, but I get asked kind of quite a bit, and actually happened today, of people from other cities, some Ohio, so it could be Cleveland or Cincinnati or Dayton, or even outside of the state. There's groups like Ohio X and other states, and it's been this really interesting like little community that I've become a part of, where we'll talk with other Midwestern states and, hey, what are you guys seeing? And what are, kind of sharing stuff. But I get asked often a lot. And today was actually by a journalist in a different part of Ohio, of, kind of comparing their city to our city. And you and I both are Columbus, I should say. So for listeners, like, hey, Columbus has had this kind of success. Like, how do we compare? Or like, we're trying to kind of build up a similar kind of success story. What would you say, like, the keys or the takeaways? And I know, the Columbus tech story is still very much a work in progress. It's still being built. But for some of these other cities that, aren't either as big or kind of on their way up as well, but maybe a few years behind, or, look to Columbus, see people like yourself, the community, the people, and there just seems to be this energy here. What would your kind of like takeaway or thoughts be for someone else that's like looking at Columbus and saying, hey, we want to do the same thing, but for our city in Ohio or our city in the Midwest?
Yeah, I think it starts with, you have to have people that are willing to contribute to the community without getting anything out of it. There was a friend of mine, Brian Zerker, he started a few companies, and he has another one now called Hopewell. But he ran a very sort of seat of the pants, show up for coffee and donuts thing, which was a pitch thing that happened just so that founders could get an opportunity to come pitch their companies and run through their decks, right? And that happened once a month, and he did it for like 7 years and got nothing out of it other than, to show up and give people the platform. Yeah. You've got to have people that are willing, that think that entrepreneurship and startups are so important to the economy and to the culture and to, being an innovative, place from a business perspective, but even just sort of from a lifestyle perspective, right? I think that Columbus now is a much more forward thinking city than it was 10 years ago. And I think part of that is, from the entrepreneurial community helping to evolve and sort of drive some of that. And so you've got to have people that are willing to do it for the good reasons of doing it, not because they're going to benefit in any way, right, from it happening. Another key linchpin that we can't ignore in Columbus that was a key catalyst was Drive Capital coming here and setting up shop. That's not an epiphany for anybody that's familiar with Drive or from Columbus, but they recruited companies that they were funding that would have been headquartered elsewhere to HQ in Columbus. Huge deal. The fact that they, write significant checks and fund companies in a very substantial way, right? Because it's, raising a round of and raising some, money that's a couple $100,000 isn't going to get you that far. But when you have a presence like Drive that's willing to write, fairly substantial checks and fund companies in a substantial way, then you have the opportunity to get results like Root and Beam and Olive and some of the others, right? And we could, we probably could just go down Drive's portfolio list and that would sort of represent what the last, period of Columbus has been. So you also can't ignore that. But I will also make a shout out, and I don't want to, sound like a broken record, and Matt Scantlin, doesn't owe me any favors, neither does Dan Mangus. But when I first started doing Startup Grind and some other events, Matt said yes, Dan said yes, that they would come and do it. Dan showed up at other events just because I asked him to, right? And you've got to, and I ran into Dan just last week at an event, And I said, man, one of the things I always appreciated about you was that you would come to support whatever was happening, even though you were super busy, right? And you had lots of things sort of, pulling at your time and attention. And you would come because you knew that other people that were following in your shoes looked at you and looked at Braintree and looked at Root as examples of, man, maybe this can work. Maybe we will end up like that, right? And you've got to have the people who are sort of doing it and living it also willing to show up and be examples for the others that are going through the grind to try to make it happen. And we have that in Columbus, and I haven't seen that everywhere, frankly.
Yeah.
I've got a large enough network, to know people in lots of places, and in lots of places, the people that have had some level of success, right, take that and they don't sort of show up at the local events, and they don't give back to the community. So it's a stew that has lots of ingredients, right? That without any one of them, it's hard to pull off. And that's why, I think the Columbus story is sort of unique, and I think others are looking at Columbus now as sort of an example of making it work. But it will be hard for them to do it and to replicate what's happened in Columbus, because their ingredients are going to be different, right? Yeah. Their stew is going to be a different stew than the Columbus, startup tech sort of scene stew has turned out to be. I actually can't cook, so I should stop using food analogies, because I actually have no idea how to make stew. So
you toss it all in.
Right, exactly. And then it tastes terrible, and then I'm like, oh man, more salt and pepper. So I'll stop using food analogies and take a breath and take a drink.
Yeah. Well, and I love how I thought you said it really well, because what was kind of striking as you were saying it is you talked about the grassroots, whereas the community and people just showing up to events, and it's like that can happen anywhere, right? But it doesn't, as you said, but it can in theory if people just showing up, but it doesn't. On the other side, the drive capital and the injection of big dollars, but that one doesn't happen everywhere, but it does happen in a lot of places that don't have that other side of the spectrum of like the grassroots, where you have that passionate community that's building it up. Because you can start a company and bring it to some city, but if you don't have that community and that collaboration and the talent and the enough employees to come into it, it doesn't really matter. So I think it was really interesting as you described it, because it was both sides, and without one or without the other, there probably wouldn't be at the place we are today. And they're both equally as important to have the money, but then to also have that kind of grassroots passion, and people showing up on weekends for stuff and just getting together and having those coffees and giving founders platforms and raising the awareness. So I really enjoyed that, so thank you for sharing that. But let's dive into now what you've been doing with AWH and some of your speaking. I'm sure you say you've been running around talking about the hype and realities of leveraging new technologies. I know you've done some stuff, I think, on like metaverse and kind of some of these other emerging tech, and you work with not just startups, but bigger organizations on kind of the innovation side. But talk to us a little bit about what you're talking about there, what you're seeing there, and would just love to kind of get your take on some of this stuff.
Yeah, fortunately, or unfortunately, digital transformation, right, as it's often sort of thrown out there, is it's sort of positioned as easy, right? It's like, well, digital transformation. It's like just pull the right levers and push the right buttons and transform. And it turns out it's actually ridiculously hard, because digital transformation and becoming a digitally capable company isn't just about the technologies. And even all of the technologies have their hypes and their potholes and their proper implementations and their misuses, right? And so there's just especially in the mid-market, but certainly at the enterprise level too, companies and leaders are getting lots of mixed signals, right? Because they're like, oh, well, should we implement machine learning and AI? Should we be all in on the cloud? Should we be looking at blockchain and those kinds of things? And the what I often talk about, and our position as a firm is problem before technology and strategy before problem, right? In that, where do you want to go as a business, right? And why are you thinking about sort of a digital transformation, and what does that mean from a business strategic perspective,
Mhm.
right? Because we see, like, most companies are probably never going to need a blockchain, right? Because a blockchain is valuable when you have anonymous people as part of a transaction, which means you don't know if you can trust them. And I was at a conference about a year ago. It was still kind of messy and complicated because we weren't sure what was really happening with the virus. But there was this conference that was happening, and I ended up sitting next to a guy at lunch who was from Daimler Chrysler.
Mhm.
And I said, "Hey, why are you here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm in the innovation group, and my sole responsibility is for us to figure out how to leverage blockchain." And I said, and he said, specifically in the supply chain. And I said, "Well, don't you know who your suppliers are, and don't you know what they're supposed to be sending you, when, and how much it's supposed to be, and when you're supposed to pay them, and all of that?" And he was like, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what do you need a blockchain for?" And then he just turned to me and he went, "Shh." And I was like, "Oh," I was like, "Okay, your secret is safe with me." And so there's a lot of misuse, and there's a lot of hype, right, and around these things that leaders often get sort of wrapped around the axles, trying to make sense of what's applicable for us, where we are, and that aligns with our strategy and that drives our strategy, and how much of it is just going to be a huge waste of time, money, and energy.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Um, yeah, I just imagine that guy, he's like running out the clock to either like retirement or like finding that next job. And then like, oh yeah, by the way, my final report is just like, don't do it.
Right. There was absolutely no use for blockchain,
Yeah.
here. And he was, an insightful guy and an
Yeah.
interesting guy. But when I sort of challenged him on, why are you guys looking at blockchain? And he was like, "I've been tasked to figure out how we can leverage blockchain,
Yeah.
and who knows, maybe they've now found some, problem in the corner that blockchain makes sense for, but it's my guess is likely not, right?"
Yeah.
But is that a inappropriate use of time and energy to have someone explore it? I guess you could say, they wouldn't know, right, whether a technology made sense or not if they didn't have somebody digging into it. But if anybody had taken 5 minutes to say, well, what is a blockchain? What is the
Mhm.
value of a blockchain? And does it make sense inside of our business relationships and transactions? In 5 minutes, you would be able to say, no, this doesn't make sense. This is
Yeah.
trying to shoehorn a technology into a situation where it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
and
interesting.
I don't want to pick on. I won't mention this company by name, but there's an insurance company who released an Alexa insurance tip of the day app.
Hmm.
Now, this is also, I think, technology, just for the sake of technology versus it chasing a problem. Because I don't know about you, I don't wake up every morning wondering what the insurance tip of the day is.
Yeah.
Um, so just because you can do something doesn't mean you
Yeah.
should.
Right.
And yet, that's what we see a lot of with the new technologies, right?
So yeah, no. And I guess my question as I was listening to this is if you're a business or you're working with a company, are there technologies that they should be, looking at, or is it completely kind of sector and industry specific where, the insurance yeah, who cares if Geico, has the tip of the day? Like I don't need that. That, what's the point of that? But, I'm thinking of like my, healthcare provider, right? Or like the hospital system in a local community. Maybe there, it's your health tip of the day, or like, get up and, have you drank all your water today? So like, how do you kind of demystify it maybe in a sense, but then also, you know which ones are perhaps worthwhile? Or do you have ones that are like, hey, people should be paying attention to this? And then like the blockchain stuff, like, most of the businesses out there, it's not worth their time or energy.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some things like the cloud and ML and AI and other things that have broader applicability than
Yeah.
something like blockchain does. Blockchain, almost um, to a 99% certainty has very little, regular business applicability. But things like the cloud do, and then you still have to peel back the layers of hype though. The cloud is sort of like Ben and Jerry's now, where there are 37 flavors of the cloud,
Yeah.
and most of it's marketing, right?
Yeah.
Because whether a cloud, like I saw, something the other day where they said that their version of the cloud was edge to edge. I have no idea what that means, right? Nobody has any idea what that means.
Yeah.
So you have to start to think about, okay, how are we going to leverage the cloud, and how does it align with our business strategy? What problems does it solve for us? How does it embolden, our business strategy? And then you've got to think about, well, what are the risks? Because one of the things that happens with the cloud is the cloud vendors, especially for mid-market companies, the startups and enterprises are very appealing to the cloud vendors, because the enterprises, lots of servers, lots of data,
Mhm.
lots of users, right? Lots of pipes, etc. The startups are the ones that could become those enterprises and also leverage the cloud to do very sort of innovative, right? Interesting new things. Mid-market companies, if you're a mid-market manufacturing company, the cloud vendors want you to sign up and then be quiet, right?
Mhm.
And they don't really want you to know how to use their platform very well, because if you figure out how to use it well and to push the right buttons and pull the right levers, you're going to use it more efficiently and you're going to pay less. And so there's a space in the market too, where mid-market companies have to be really careful leveraging some of these new technologies, because they're not the target market for the vendors of these technologies. They're sort of in this squishy middle that the vendors don't really want to spend a lot of time supporting and making them effective at leveraging the technology. So
Mhm.
many mid-market companies have to go it on their own, which then has great sort of risk associated to it from a cost and a security
Yeah.
perspective. We saw a healthcare company that had a cloud service turned on for 6 months that cost $23,000 a month, that they
Wow.
didn't know was even turned on. So the cloud, for all of its hype, is not for the uninitiated, but mid-market companies sort of struggle to get the support from the cloud purveyors, right? That can get them up to speed in a way that they can leverage it adequately. So there's a lot of buyer beware inside of
Yeah.
the hype of some of the stuff.
Interesting. And I'll do one final kind of follow up on this before we go to our quick questions, not necessarily quick answers, is the last third of our show. But you've mentioned kind of that middle market, or small to medium sized businesses out there. What I, and especially in a place like Ohio, manufacturing, some of these that maybe don't have big IT departments, or maybe they're big businesses but they don't have a big technology side of the company. As you're, if you're sitting down next to not the head of innovation at a car company, but maybe you're on a plane next to the CEO of a mid-market company, and he's trying to, talk to, all this stuff, artificial intelligence, we've talked about blockchain, the cloud, AL, or machine learning, and all this stuff. How do you advise, or how do you encourage that CEO to consider these emerging technologies, to figure out what could actually help, and kind of demystify the realness versus these hype cycles of crazy Silicon Valley pitch decks that just have every buzzword out there, and as you said, paying thousands of dollars for maybe some of these solutions or technologies that are just wasting time that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, it all comes back to having that very strategic overall business conversation. Um, and we have a client now that is a manufacturing company. And when I started talking with them, and when we started talking to them about engaging, he said, and he was about a $25 million business at the time, and he said, I want to get to be a $50 million business.
Hmm.
And he said, I know that's not. He said, I know that's not going to come from people, because 20 years ago, even probably as recent as maybe 5 years ago, most mid-market companies would say, well, I'm just going to grow by hiring more people. I'm just going to increase my workforce. as it's getting harder and harder to hire, the number of people that are needed and the skills that are needed, then it almost always then falls back on technology and automation in some form, right? To sort of fill in that gap, to fuel that growth. But it really becomes, okay, you're a $25 million company, you want to become a $50 million company. How would you get there, right? By leveraging technology. And it's probably not all the hype stuff, right, that gets hyped. It's probably, do you have some bottlenecks in your manufacturing process that could use some automation? Do you have some automation that can happen inside of mundane administrative tasks like data entry, right, or conversion of things from paper documents into some sort of CRM or database? Is there an opportunity to empower your customers through some self-service digital commerce stuff, right? And as you take out efficiency, that almost always or inefficiency, that almost always equates to efficiency, which then hopefully is what fuels the growth. But it really all starts with understanding the business and then the business strategy, and then figuring out, okay, where are the friction points inside of that technology can be the WD-40 that applies a little bit of lubricant to those friction points. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. And I'm, being in Ohio, Midwest, where we have a lot of those manufacturing companies, or a ton, there's a ton of these family-owned businesses that have been around. I knew of one in northeastern Ohio that was pretty much like the exclusive partner for a really important part of our grocery supply chain. And it was kind of amazing getting to kind of see it behind the hood of, just the amount of technology, kind of nothing crazy. Don't have to, artificial intelligence and buy this or do that, but just some of these probably basic processes that could kind of just be, really improved on, and can, isn't on the workforce side, which there's a ton of challenges there with, just kind of hiring and retaining workers, especially in some of kind of these more manual things that, our state kind of has a real, kind of a real, it's a real big part of our economy. So all interesting stuff. So Ryan, we'll dive into the last portion where we do 4 questions. We ask all our guests these same questions. So it's fun to get different perspectives and kind of see what different people are saying.
Ooh, scary.
Yeah, nothing too bad.
Okay.
But the first one is what is a challenge you're working to solve? And so as we kind of like to frame it, especially for tech leaders, is, it could be very business specific. When COVID started, like a big answer was, this new remote workforce and no one's in the office. But so it could be like kind of like that, or it could be, wrapping your head around some of these big emerging techs out there. So first one is, what's a challenge that you're working to solve currently?
Yeah, I would say it's team connectivity. So I would piggyback on the remote, work piece of it. We've gone all remote. We still have an office, but nobody really goes there. A couple of team members do when they need a place to go. We've got somebody on our team that has triplets, and they're about 2 now. So he needs to go to the office sometimes, just to get a break from being the dad of three young ones. But we're but I think a lot now about, because we used to do, as many did, right? We would say, hey, at 4:30, a bunch of us are going to go over to Pins, and play some games and have a couple of drinks, and a bunch of people would go to lunch together. That's all gone. So now I think a lot about, well, how do we keep connectivity? How do we keep people engaged? How do we keep, I think culture is an overused term. And so I don't like to use it. I just like to think about connectedness and sort of engagement. And so trying to think about that in a new paradigm where it's just hard to sort of spontaneously say, hey, yeah, let's go,
Right.
let's go to happy hour. Or let's get together and play Connect 4 in the office, right, for an hour and see who the Connect 4 champion is, right? Yeah. We've lost all of that. How do you keep some of that inside of a completely different paradigm that we're operating in now?
Yeah, and that's I don't know if anyone has quite that answer, but
Right. If you talk to
it's a
somebody
huge
that
one.
does, then
Yeah,
have them email
yeah,
me. Right.
yeah, yeah, exactly. That'll be for our third question. Kind of some foreshadowing, but our second one is, what's a favorite read, listen, or watch? So this could be a book, a podcast, or show. Maybe something you revisit once a year, or something that you've been reading or binging lately.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw this nod to another Ryan Holiday. The obstacles is the way is a great book. Um, I think every book that he's written, I think that it's just really well grounded stuff that's not, full of platitudes and not overhyped. And I think we could all use a lot more grounding in our lives, maybe now more than ever. And so he writes a lot about, very fundamental approaches to being grounded and staying grounded. So I tend to like most of the stuff that he puts out.
Yeah, that's a good one. And so question number three, and this is where, figuring out the connectivity and work. But what's a problem that you'd solve or a business you'd start if someone said, "Hey, here's $100 million check, no dilution, go tackle something big." What would it be?
Yeah, that would certainly be near the top of the list.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because I think that that's one that a lot of people are struggling with now. But I also don't know that
yeah,
I don't know there's a technological
right.
product solution to that problem either. Right. Um, I think that there is also, so one of the things I've thought about over the last few years is, um, there needs to be what's the right way to say this? There needs to be an e-commerce preference platform. And what I mean by that is a platform that you can go into to put your shopping preferences. So shoe size,
Hmm,
pant sizes, shirt size, hat size, shipping preferences, packing preferences, what have you. So that when you go to various e-commerce companies, you don't now have to
hmm,
filter by size, right?
yeah.
It could make an API call to this platform, suck in your preferences, and then you don't have to go through all these filtering things to get to the products that you want on their site. It's going to present you the things that already match your preferences.
Hmm. That's really, and not to steal your idea, but it's really interesting because the other kind of side would be you put on all your preferences over time. To use the buzzword, the artificial intelligence or the machine learning, figures out, oh, you like these brands, you like this style, and it helps you discover new companies that otherwise, I'll just keep going back to the same three stores that I've bought the same clothes at for the past 10 years, and never go discover anything else. That's really interesting. I really like that one a lot.
Yeah, I would. I think that I would use it.
Yeah, right.
But it's one of those things and I always caution founders around this and product teams is you have to sort of remove your personal bias from it,
Yeah.
right? And this is one of those things where every time I go to an e-commerce site, I'm like, oh God, I've got to filter by my size now. Why does
Yeah.
this other platform exist? It would be a behind the scenes platform, just like Stripe is, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever from a payment perspective, right? We don't think about how we pay anymore, right? Well, we shouldn't have to think about sort of shopping preferences.
Yeah.
We ought to be able to manage that somewhere and it be ubiquitous wherever we
Oh,
go, that it gets leveraged. So
that's cool.
I don't know, maybe there's something there for somebody to work on.
Yeah, well, there's as you know, there's a growing kind of e-commerce world, especially Columbus, but then also down in Cincinnati. So, maybe it'll be a new Ohio startup soon. Fourth, final question is, what is your favorite place in Ohio? So you can answer it different ways of just where you go on the weekends. If you have friends or family coming in town, what are you taking? Where are you taking them? But your favorite place in Ohio?
I'm going to answer that in two ways.
Okay.
First one is any coffee shop. Well,
Okay.
except for like a national chain. I like
Yeah.
local independent coffee shops.
Okay.
Um, and secondly, would be the woods in southern Ohio. I have a cabin down there, as we were talking, before we jumped on to record this, and I like Zaleski State Forest. I'm an outdoors guy, so I want to be on a trail, doing something. So the woods of Southern Ohio, from Hocking Hills over to Lusky State Forest, is my jam.
Love it. And follow up coffee shop, non-national chains. What are your favorite Columbus ones?
Any of the Stoffs locations,
Yeah.
but my favorite is the Stoffs on Grandview Avenue in Grandview, because that feels like what a coffee shop is supposed to feel like, right? The floors are uneven. The hardwood creaks as you're walking on
the
it.
tables shake.
The tables are uneven, so you're
Yeah.
not sure whether you're going to spill your coffee after you've gotten it, right? Which puts you on alert, to not spill your coffee on your Mac. So I like that. And then Brioso downtown, and then have to give my buddy Kenny Sipes at Roosevelt a shout out, right?
Oh,
yeah, they do a bunch of good work supporting nonprofits as part of their business model and their sales, and so that's what I said. I love all of them because I love coffee, and I love the vibe of coffee shops. There is something about the being there that you'll see people that are in 3-piece suits, right? Probably doing some governmental regulatory deal, and then there'll be people in hoodies and shorts when it's 20 degrees out, and you're like, oh my god, what are you doing in shorts and in a hoodie when it's 20 degrees out? So it's also a great sort of snapshot of society and sort of the neighborhood where that coffee shop lives. So dig hanging out at a coffee shop and writing there and working and sort of getting a little slice of Americana as part of it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, as you're, kind of describing it, I thought the same thing of, like, especially for those listening in Columbus, Stoffs is one kind of, there's a couple different locations, but the Grandview Avenue one, Grandview Heights is a small little city that's kind of tucked away, kind of within borders Columbus, and it's got the kind of quintessential, like, Americana downtown. Grandview Ave has the shops and the cafe and the restaurants. But you see kind of everything because it's close to downtown. You get students from Ohio State. And then especially they have a great outdoor, so you can sit outside when the weather's nice and people watch, and it's just, it's awesome. So love those answers. And at some point we'll have to grab a coffee at one of those, and maybe even an outdoor one if the weather keeps warming up and spring comes a little bit sooner. But
I know upper 50s today and relatively sunny this morning. So this is like, maybe we've turned a corner where we're not going to have to wear a parka every day.
Right.
That'll be awesome.
That would be awesome. But Rye, this has been great. Thanks so much for sharing your work that you're doing now, the work that you have been doing as part of building up Columbus and building up Ohio's tech scene. But anything we didn't talk about that you want to share, and if not, how can people connect with you, find about AWH, your work?
Best way is probably LinkedIn, and I know there are a lot of people that don't like LinkedIn anymore, and they're like, oh, that's terrible product and somebody should build a better one. Nobody's built a better one yet. So that's probably the easiest way. They can, you can find me on Twitter and some other places. And then AWH is awh.net is our site. People can also get in touch with me there.
Cool. Well, we'll link all those in the show notes. So for those listening, watching, just scroll down a little bit, connect with Ryan if you're on LinkedIn, or give him a follow on Twitter, or check out AWH and the work they're doing. But Ryan, thanks again for joining. Again, a ton of fun. Always enjoyed chatting and getting to listen to you kind of talk about tech, whether it's about the ecosystem stuff we're talking about, or some of your innovator roundtables that you host, which are always fun when I get to join. So thanks a lot. Thanks again for everything you're doing, and we appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Chris, great to see you. Thanks for having me.